I must thank all who participated in the inquiry and the chair, Sir Adrian Fulford, and his team. Today, Sir Adrian published the report of the inquiry's first phase. This summer, the government will provide a full response. This will also cover Lord Anderson's Prevent review. Today, I will provide the government's initial reaction to an inquiry that exposes a series of tragic failures from which we must learn. We do so in the shadow of the events of the 29th of July 2024. I will not name the perpetrator, nor dwell on the details of the crimes that saw 3 beautiful young girls murdered, the attempted murder of 8 other children and 2 adults, and lasting physical and psychological harm to many more. I know I speak on behalf of the whole House when I say my thoughts today are with all those affected. Yeah. In honour of them and the memory of 3 murdered girls, Elsie Stankum, B.B. King and Alice de Silva Aguiar, we must now act to prevent similar attacks. It was for that reason that my predecessor appointed Sir Adrian Fulford to lead a full statutory inquiry. The inquiry's work has 2 parts. The first, which reported today, considered the decisions made by the agencies and services that interacted with the perpetrator. This included a range of institutions within the criminal justice system, as well as education, healthcare and local government. It also considered the actions of the perpetrator's parents. The findings of the inquiry are unsparing. Sir Adrian has uncovered systematic failures across multiple public sector organisations. The recording and sharing of information was poor. None of the agencies involved had a full understanding of the risk that the perpetrator posed, and many did not take steps to assess the risk that he posed to others. There was a failure by the agencies involved to take responsibility, and nobody was clear as to who was in charge. So the failure, because it belonged to everyone, belonged to no one. Where individuals missed opportunities to intervene, lessons must be learnt. But they did so within organisations that repeatedly passed the risk to others and where systemic failings existed. The perpetrator came into contact with the state on countless occasions. Lancashire Police responded to 5 calls to his home address. The police were called when he was in possession of a knife in a public place. He was referred on several occasions to the multi-agency safeguarding hub. He came into contact with Children's Social Care, the Early Help Service, and Children's Mental Health Services. He was referred to Prevent on 3 occasions. He was convicted of a violent assault and referred to a youth offending team. All failed to identify the risk that the perpetrator posed, and so he fell between the gaps. The warning signs were missed, a growing history of violence, and a clear and continuing intent to commit harm. In the Home Office, the focus falls on prevent and policing. Sir Adrian is clear that police should have progressed the perpetrator to the multi-agency Channel programme. Channel could have actively assessed and managed his risk. Instead, he was not deemed suitable because he had no fixed ideology. This ran counter to the guidance at the time, but the thresholds were unclear and the guidance was applied inconsistently. The perpetrator's multiple referrals were also considered individually when they should have been seen as a cumulative and compounding risk. The perpetrator did not receive the correct interventions, and his autism diagnosis meant that professionals focused far too much on his vulnerability and far too little on the threat that he might pose to others. The horrific attack was itself evidence of the ease with which it could be concluded. There was no restrictions to stop the perpetrator from watching the violent content that inspired him, nor downloading instructions to make poison, nor viewing terrorist materials online. He was also able to bypass the safeguards that should have stopped him from buying and receiving dangerous weapons. These findings are devastating, but they are not surprising. Findings like these have been heard in inquests and inquiries before. This time, however, they must be a spur for change. The inquiry makes 67 recommendations. The government is reviewing these and will respond to those which relate to national government this summer, and I expect local agencies to do the same. Since this awful crime, the government has already acted. And that begins with Prevent. Since the Southport attack, the Home Office and counter-terrorism policing have reviewed historical cases to ensure that similar instances were handled correctly, with cases reassessed for any change in risk and managed accordingly. This government has reviewed the prevent thresholds and published updated guidance. We've introduced a new prevent assessment framework with mandatory training for counter-terrorism case officers. Oversight of repeat prevent referrals has been strengthened, ensuring that cumulative risk is not missed and that senior sign-off is required before a case is closed. And to prevent independent oversight of the whole system, we created an independent prevent commissioner, and I would like to thank Lord Anderson for so ably taking on that position on an interim basis. His term ends today, and I am pleased to say that I've appointed Tim Jakes as the new Prevent Commissioner, who begins his role tomorrow. This government has also begun to place greater controls on a dangerously unregulated online world. The Online Safety Act requires companies to remove illegal content from their platforms. The Act is intended to limit children from encountering content that is legal but poses a risk of significant harm. But this is just the beginning of what can and must be done. The internet remains a dangerous place for children, and we are clear that tech companies have a moral responsibility to keep their users safe. But have no doubt that when they fail to do so, this government will intervene, which is why the government is consulting on whether to remove children's access to social media entirely. I can also announce today that we will legislate to prevent the spread of extreme violent content online. We've also made it harder for people to purchase weapons. The Crime and Policing Bill places new controls on the online sale and delivery of knives. We have banned the manufacture, purchase and possession of ninja swords and zombie-style machetes. And earlier this year, we published new guidance mandating that any child caught with a knife must be referred to a youth offending team. In the aftermath of the attack, the government commissioned Jonathan Hall KC, the independent reviewer of terrorism legislation, to consider the legislative gaps exposed by this attack. This identified an inconsistency that clearly needed addressing. Unlike terrorist attacks, if you are planning an attack without an underlying ideology, there is no crime on the statute book. Jonathan Hall therefore recommended the creation of a new offence, and this legislation will also be brought forward as soon as parliamentary time allows. But the inquiry also identifies a wider issue. There are rising numbers of young men who are fascinated by extreme violence, boys whose minds are warped by time spent in isolation online. And this is a risk to us all. Where someone is vulnerable to terrorism, they can and should be managed through the Prevent programme. However, where they are not, there is no clear approach to that risk. Today, we publish the terms of reference for the second part of the Southport inquiry, and it will face directly into this challenge. Sir Adrian will provide recommendations on the adequacy of existing arrangements across all arms of the state for identifying and managing the risk posed by violence-fixated individuals. He will explore what specific interventions are required to reduce the risk to the public. He will also review the influence of the internet and social media and the ease with which weapons can be procured. Sir Adrian begins this work immediately and will present his final recommendations next spring. Madam Deputy Speaker, in the summer of 2024, an act of unspeakable evil took place in Southport. Nothing will ever heal the pain of those who survive, including the families who suffered unimaginable loss. Responsibility rests with the perpetrator. But there is also responsibility within the family. The perpetrator's parents knew the risk he posed, but did not cooperate with the authorities. And there is also responsibility on the state and on all of us here to learn the lessons from failures wherever they occurred. And the lesson is that the failures happened everywhere. We must ensure we do not find ourselves here again, grieving deaths which should never have happened had the state and those who worked within it acted differently. Madam Deputy Speaker, that is our task, and I commend this statement to the House.
Shadow Home Secretary Chris Philp.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I thank the Home Secretary for advance sight of her statement. Let us remember the three victims of this savage attack: BB King, aged just 6, Elsie Scandcombe, aged 7, and Alice da Silva Aguiar, aged 9, and 8 more children and 2 adults who were seriously injured. I also want to thank Merseyside Emergency Services who responded to this event. As the Home Secretary quite rightly said, this report identifies very serious, repeated failings by public bodies. Sir Adrian said, and I quote, "A merry-go-round of referrals, assessments, case closures and handoffs meant no agency took the lead or properly addressed the danger Rudakubana posed. Multiple opportunities were missed to prevent this tragedy." Sir Adrian also found Rudakubana's parents created, quotes, "significant obstructions to constructive engagement." Sir Adrian makes important recommendations. I'm glad the Home Secretary will respond by the summer, and we on this side of the House will support necessary actions. During the inquiry, we heard evidence given by Rudakubana's former head teacher, Joanne Hodson. She told the inquiry she was pressured by mental health services to water down the EHCP to minimise the danger posed by Rudakubana because of his ethnicity. Miss Hodson told the inquiry this, and I quote verbatim, "My efforts to include this information in the EHCP were met with hostility by the father and also by mental health services. Miss Steed, who was from CAMS, even went as far as to accuse me of racially stereotyping AR as a black boy with a knife. Nothing could be further from the truth. But in the end, the wording of the EHCP was rewritten in many places." That's the end of her verbatim quote. Madam Deputy Speaker, this contributed to the clear risks being missed. The Nottingham inquiry into the 3 tragic murders there identified exactly the same issue. Mental health professionals in Nottingham decided not to section Valdo Calicone because they were concerned about, and again I quote verbatim, "an over-representation of young black males in detention." And the government's own notes accompanying the King's speech on the mental health bill even refer to this issue as well. Madam Deputy Speaker, the fixation with ethnic disproportionality is deeply damaging. Ethnicity should never be a consideration when an agency is taking steps to protect the public. Everybody should simply be treated exactly the same. We cannot allow dangerous individuals to avoid detention for public safety simply because of their ethnicity. Everybody should be treated the same. I think it would be helpful if the Home Secretary makes clear from the dispatch box that she agrees with that approach and sets out how the government will change their approach in the future. Today's report also makes clear that Rudakubana's autism was wrongly allowed to inhibit the way he was dealt with. Yet the government's King's speech, notes to the mental health bill, again expressly says people with autism should be sectioned less often. Given the findings of today's report, will the government reconsider that? I also want to raise the aftermath of this tragedy, which saw serious rioting. It is, of course, important to avoid prejudicing criminal trials. However, as Jonathan Hall, the independent reviewer of terrorism legislation, said, and I quote, "The government has to be aware that if there is an information gap, other voices, particularly on social media, will try to fill it." He went on, "Quite often, there's a fair amount that can be put into the public domain, and indeed, in October, 2 or 3 months after the attack, but well before the trial, information concerning the Al-Qaeda terror manual and ricin was put in the public domain without prejudicing the trial." So I think the failure to provide information did create an information vacuum in those early days of August 2024, and that vacuum was filled by untrue speculation online, some of it originating outside the UK, which fueled the riots. So, having regard to that, will the Home Secretary commit to making sure such information is routinely released in cases of public interest in the future? Madam Deputy Speaker, as the mother of Elsie said at the inquiry, this tragedy must be a line in the sand. We owe it to the victims, to the survivors, and to their families to learn the lessons from this tragedy and to make sure it never happens again.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And let me say I welcome the Shadow Home Secretary's comments about potentially working together on the changes that need to be made as a result of the initial findings of the inquiry. The Government will respond by the summer, and I look forward to discussions with him and with others in this House to make sure that the House is united as one in the action that needs to be taken. As he says, that is the very least that we owe the victims' families and all those who've been affected by this horrific tragedy. Let me just say on the issue of Mrs Hodson, the head teacher, whose specific testimony he referred to, she of course gave evidence, and I believe that the position that she took was vindicated very strongly by the chair in the findings of the inquiry. And let me be absolutely clear, the only factors that should be taken into account are the potential risk posed by an individual and how best to manage that risk. No other factors are relevant, and it is clear, not just in relation to the experience that Mrs Hodson had, but actually the failures that existed across a multiplicity of public agency. That was the failure to appropriately assess the risk that the perpetrator posed to others, which was at the heart of the problem, and that is how he managed to slip through the cracks, because no one agency took responsibility for the assessment of that risk and ultimately for the managing of the risk that the perpetrator posed to others. Those are the only factors that should ever be taken into account, and I will be working closely with government ministers from other departments as we formulate our full response to the findings by the inquiry and setting out what our expectations are of professionals, not just in health but in other public services as well. Let me also say on the diagnosis of autism, Sir Adrian in his report did make it clear that it would be wrong to make a general association between autism and increased risk of violence to others. But he also found that in the perpetrator's case, the way his autism manifested did increase the risk of harm that he posed to others. And it does show the absolute importance of taking a case-by-case approach and making sure that all factors are adequately taken into account and that agencies take responsibility for how that risk is going to be managed. And again, there are good lessons to learn from this for health practitioners and for others in our local services when it comes to both assessment of risk but also ultimately for how it is best managed. Let me say to him on the issues relating to the communications post the attack taking place, especially at a point where there was a lot of misinformation that was being spread, particularly online. He will know that there has already been a change in practice, learning the lessons of what happened then. There was, of course, a well-meaning desire to make sure that nothing was done that might prejudice a future trial, but exactly how the rules are applied, I think, can be a matter of interpretation and degree. The College of Policing has already created new professional practice in its guidance for police officers. There is already now a new CPS, that is to say the Crown Prosecution Service and media protocol, and we are developing a new charter between criminal justice agencies and the media to make sure that whatever information can readily and easily be made available is done so at the earliest opportunity. It will always be incredibly important that nothing is done that might prejudice a future trial, but I know he will acknowledge that since this horrific attack, there's already been a change in approach to comms, and the government and other agencies have already in other instances and in other cases been making much more information available to the media and ultimately therefore to the public. Let me just say in conclusion, Madam Deputy Speaker, I know that the findings of the inquiry and also when Phase 2 reports will be of great interest to members across the whole House, and I do look forward to working not just with the official opposition but with all parties to make sure that the House is as one in the response to this horrific tragedy. That is what we owe all of the victims of this case.
Chris Webb.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I welcome the Home Secretary's statement this afternoon. My constituents expect Prevent to keep them safe. So can she reiterate what changes she will be making as Home Secretary in this government to prevent, to help stop an attack like this again in the future?
Thank you. My honourable friend makes an incredibly important point on the reliance that all of us place upon the PREVENT programme, that we should rightly be able to place on that programme to make sure it is as strong as it is possible to be in preventing tragedies and diverting people away from potentially committing a terrorist act and driving them away from extremism more broadly. We have already been delivering a number of improvements to the PREVENT programme. There is new statutory guidance, there's improved training, new case management systems, much stronger interventions for people who are already on the programme, and a strengthened approach to managing repeat referrals. So where you've got a number of referrals which individually might have not led to an onward referral to the channel stream, the cumulative impact is now already being taken into account. There is also now a much more robust risk assessment tool, and I think the totality of the changes that we've already made have put the programme in a much stronger position. But of course, learning the findings from this inquiry, we will take more action as necessary.
Liberal Democrat spokesperson Jess Brown-Fuller.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I thank the Home Secretary for advance sight of her statement. To know that there were so many missed opportunities to stop the Southport attack is truly heartbreaking, and my thoughts today are with the bereaved families whose young daughters were so cruelly taken from them, and the many other victims who suffered unimaginable trauma that day. We owe it to them to make every attempt to prevent a senseless attack like this from ever happening again. And the report today lays bare that agency after agency failed to step up and take ownership of the risks that the perpetrator posed. There are monumental failures across a number of authorities: the police, PREVENT, NHS mental health services, children's social care, youth offending services, and the perpetrators' parents. This is simply not acceptable. So can the Home Secretary please confirm how soon she plans to report back on whether the government will be accepting all 67 of the recommendations, and will she commit to providing Parliament with an update on progress every 6 months? Today's report exposes serious oversights also by online giants that allowed the perpetrator to collect an arsenal of weapons without effective age verification checks. Will the Home Secretary confirm whether the recently published knife crime strategy will address the ease with which knives are available for purchase online and crack down on those big tech companies like Amazon who are putting profit above protocol when it comes to the sale of dangerous items? And finally, the Liberal Democrats have long argued that PREVENT is not fit for purpose, and it is deeply shocking that the perpetrator was referred 3 times and yet no further action was taken. We understand that was because he didn't possess a specific ideology. Well, there should be no clearer sign of a system unable to address modern threats. So will the Home Secretary today commit to a full overhaul of PREVENT within this Parliament so that warning future signs aren't missed? And will she commit to bringing forward the legislation recommended by Jonathan Hall KC in the next King's Speech?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Let me thank the Liberal Democrat spokeswoman for her comments, and she's absolutely right. The sheer number of missed opportunities in this case is truly horrifying, and it's why we must do everything we can to reform all of these systems within our public services to make sure no such incident can happen again. Let me say to her, there will be a comprehensive response from the government on all of the recommendations made from phase 1 of the inquiry. I intend to do so before the summer, so the House will have an opportunity to debate that. And of course, as we move to delivery of the government's response to the recommendations, I will of course keep the House updated on our progress, including on where potential future legislation might also be needed. Let me say to her, in terms of the sale of knives in the Crime and Policing Bill, which is still continuing its passage through Parliament, we have introduced new age verification checks both at the point of sale and also at point of delivery of knives, as a way of directly responding to some of the issues that we've seen in this case, where the perpetrator was able to slip through the system. That should not be possible in the future once the bill becomes an Act of Parliament and is implemented. Let me also say to her on the threat posed by those who are fixated by violence but who don't necessarily have an ideology, or who have a mixed ideology, or who flit into having an ideology and then not having one. There is a developing complex picture of the sorts of threats that we are facing. We've made it very clear that those who have no fixed ideology but are vulnerable to terrorism are still and should be referred to the PREVENT programme. That remains the lead programme for dealing with the risk posed by those individuals. The inquiry recognises that there is a gap from those who do not have a fixed ideology, who are not vulnerable to terrorism, who might slip through. The phase 2 of the inquiry will consider how best to respond to those sorts of cases. We'll make recommendations on who should take the lead on dealing with those individuals. But I want to assure the Honourable Lady and all members in the House, the government is not simply waiting for phase 2 to report. We're already trialling with a number of local authorities a new approach for those who are below the threshold for prevent, but who have a risk that we are concerned about and where we believe that they might pose a risk of harm to others, to think about different ways in which agencies might handle that risk to make sure that those individuals don't slip through the net. And as we learn lessons from those pilots, we will seek to start implementing them whilst we wait, of course, for Sir Adrian Fulford and the inquiry team to come forward with fuller recommendations on this later in the future.
Marco.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and can I thank the Home Secretary for her statement. I'd like to place on record my sympathies to the families of Alice, Elsie and Bibi, who are living with the most unimaginable loss. The Southport attack has been ruled a disaster waiting to happen after the perpetrator was referred to prevent on 3 separate occasions, and other multi-agency failings have been highlighted by Sir Adrian Fulford. On the 20th of June 2020, my constituents, Gary and Jan Furlong, lost their son James, who was murdered during the Forbury Gardens terrorist attack. I'm also thinking of them today, Madam Deputy Speaker. Like Southport, the perpetrator of the Forbury Gardens attack had been referred to prevent 4 separate times, and multi-agency failures were also highlighted by Sir Adrian Fulford. And like the deaths of Alice, Elsie and Bibi, the deaths of James Furlong, Dr David Wales and Joseph Ritchie Bennis were ruled as probably avoidable. I acknowledge that it will take some time to go through the 67 recommendations that has been made in respect of Southport, but can the Home Secretary advise, despite the improvement she has outlined today in respect to prevent, does she actually believe that prevent is fit for purpose? And to quote the Home Secretary, Madam Deputy Speaker, from her statement, she said, "We must ensure we do not find ourselves here again, grieving deaths which should never have happened had the state and those work within it acted differently." But the fact is that we are here again, Madam Deputy Speaker, and we are here time and time again after multi-agency failures. So can she immediately take respect in respect of joined-up partnership working and outline to us what those steps will be to ensure that no family has to endure such loss?
Home Secretary.
Well, can I thank my honourable friend for what she has just said, and also associate myself with her remarks about the victims and the families of those who died in the Forbury Gardens attack. She is absolutely right. We have been here far too many times. This must be a moment of change. I'm very hopeful that with such a thorough report from Sir Adrian Fulford, with such clear practical recommendations for action to prevent such a tragedy occurring in the future, that we can and will make progress. And I do ask her, and I know she will accept that this is what we owe the families, and this is the very least that we owe all of the families. And I do look forward to working with colleagues across the House to implement recommendations as we move forward. We all have to do more, and government agencies all have to do more as well. Let me assure her that I'm standing up a task force to bring together all government ministers with relevant responsibilities to make sure that we are beginning work immediately on improving the systems and the processes that are in place at the moment, and that we're not still simply waiting for the final phase of the inquiry to report. So there will be more progress. We have taken steps on reforming Prevent. I know that the Prevent strategy, the work that it does, has been of interest in this House for many years and has been scrutinised very, very thoroughly. Let me say to her, an intervention programme of this kind is always going to have to move very quickly to deal with changing threat patterns. So even if we just look at Islamist extremism, for example, the way that might have presented in the era of Daesh and ISIL in Syria, sort of becoming prominent, is different to how it presents now. And practitioners have to be able to adapt as quickly as the presentation of extremist ideologies is developing as well. So it will always be a work in progress. I think that is something that that we should acknowledge, just because the nature of the threat is changing so quickly and so regularly. But we can and we will have strong mechanisms in place to make sure that it does the job that we all know it needs to do.
Dr. Caroline Johnson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Madam Deputy Speaker, as a consultant paediatrician, I have to undertake prevent training at regular intervals. And in each one of those occasions, I've raised with ministers my concerns about either the quality or the emphasis or both of this training. But I wonder if the Home Secretary could say whether she feels that in this particular situation, the problem was mostly that the perpetrator didn't conform to the usual patterns that people were being trained to spot, that people were being badly trained, that people were not using their training diligently, or that the actions once a case had been reported were not followed through. Which was the major factor, does she think?
Home Secretary.
Well, let me say to the Honourable Lady, I'll be happy to hear her personal experiences of the quality of that training. I think this is the first time she and I have had an interaction on this matter. I'll be very happy to pick those issues up offline. Well, let me say on the substance of her point, we must follow the findings of the inquiry chair, who said that there were 5 major failures here, that no single agency took ownership of the risk that the perpetrator posed, that there was poor information recording and management, but also that sometimes the behaviour was excused on the basis of his perceived or diagnosed autism spectrum disorder. So there are a range of factors in place. I think we should follow the evidence and the findings of the inquiry chair, and we will respond based on the failures that have been found.
Helen Hayes.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. All of our thoughts are today with the families of Alice, Bibi and Elsie. They have already suffered the most horrific loss. To have confirmation today from Sir Adrian Fulford that their loss was preventable is utterly unbearable. Sir Adrian's report highlights the failure of the multi-agency safeguarding hub, exactly the place where joint responsibility between different agencies should have been held. And he also said that children's services were not well equipped to manage a risk presented by a young person as distinct from risks to a young person. Can I therefore ask the Home Secretary what plans she has to work with the Department for Education and the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government to ensure that as a matter of urgency, every professional working with high-risk young people knows exactly what to do when they are fearful that a young person is a risk to others and is accountable for taking that action?
Home Secretary.
Well, my honourable friend notes one of the absolute key failures, which is on who the risk is to. And in this case, too much of the internal assessments were on the risk to the perpetrator himself and not on the risk that he posed to others. And that must change. There were practical recommendations from Sir Adrian Fulford for the individual agencies. But I think it speaks to a need for a cultural shift, I think, in the way that these cases are looked at and managed. That will be a cultural shift for colleagues in the health department, in education, as well as in housing, communities and local government. Where a prevent referral is made because there is a vulnerability to terrorism, there are already systems in place that would enable those risk assessments to be made on the basis of risk posed to others. Of course, here it should have been made but was not made, the onward referral to Channel, as should have happened. But we have to make sure that even where the onward referral to Channel doesn't take place and somebody doesn't quite fit the threshold for prevent, that they are still picked up, and that cultural shift for management of risk, assessment of risk and dealing with it is taking into account all of the findings that Sir Adrian Fulford has made.
Sir Bernard Jenkins.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I thank the Home Secretary for her statement and for the way she is promoting learning rather than blaming, because that is the best way to get the change we need, and for her very robust response to my right honourable friend, the Shadow Home Secretary, about the point he raised, and for the point she now makes about the requirement of a cultural shift. Can she take a close interest in this? Because not many leaders in many organisations understand that that means changing the attitudes and behaviours of individuals in their organisations. It's not just about setting a policy. And that requires a very concerted act of leadership and diligence and consistency, and making sure that those who don't want to make the change are eased out of their positions, and there are no promotions for those people who don't respect and demonstrate the changed attitudes and behaviours that are required. This is a big ask and doesn't often happen in the public service.
Home Secretary.
I thank the honourable gentleman. Let me say to him, it is a big ask, and I am very clear this must be a moment of change. I don't want to be standing here with a future tragedy saying the same things that have been said in response to what happened in Southport. We owe the families a true moment of change for the way that public services are delivered, and he is absolutely right. The cultural shift is absolutely critical to the ability to make onward progress here, whether that is agencies that don't normally consider risk posed to others because they're primarily concerned about the risk of harm a person poses to themselves and their clinical need that is different to a wider societal need to protect others from harm. And I do think that that is now something that we are going to have to look at very closely as a government and to bring forward real change within our health service, within education and within local government as well. Let me assure him and the House I will take a close personal interest because at the end of the day, preventing harm and keeping our people safe is my responsibility. Where people meet the threshold for being dealt with through the prevent strategy and onward referral to channel. I will make sure we do everything we can to have those mechanisms as robust as possible, but where they are below that threshold, as a society we still need an answer, and of course I will take a very close interest in that myself.
Sarah Russell.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I know that the whole House's thoughts are with the family and of course mine are too. One of the many aspects of what has gone wrong here relates to children's mental health services. And could the Home Secretary please outline what we are doing about the workforce for children's mental health services, because there is a real shortage of people who are skilled in this area.
Home Secretary.
Yes, my honourable friend makes an absolutely important point. The government's obviously already taken steps to shore up the provision of mental health services within the National Health Services. I'm joined by colleagues from the Health Department today who I know are listening very closely and will be absorbing the findings that Sir Adrian Fulford has made in phase 1 of his inquiry, and I will be working with all ministers across government before we formulate our fuller response to all of the 67 recommendations, but let me assure her the provision of mental health services will be absolutely critical to the work the government does as a result of this inquiry.
Adnan Hussain.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Home Secretary's statement confirms the core failure that when everyone was responsible, no one was accountable. And we have seen this pattern before. The same passing of the buck in safeguarding, the same passing of the buck in grooming gang cases and in mental health. We have heard today about reviews, frameworks and guidance, but not enforcement. So I'd be grateful if the Home Secretary could tell this House plainly, if recommendations are not followed to the letter, what consequences will follow?
Secretary.
Well, the honourable gentleman is right that, of course, it's one thing to bring about changes and to change professional practice, but of course these things should be enforced properly. When the government responds in full before the summer, in terms of our response to all 67 of the recommendations, I will lay out what our expectations are going forward. I think it's important to recognise Sir Adrian Fulford doesn't make individual findings of fact in terms of individuals and those failings because there was such widespread system failure. So I do think it is right that in the first instance the government looks at the wider systems that we have in place. But of course, within those systems, ultimately, if there are failures and there are individual failures, there should be accountability.
Chris Vince.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I thank the Home Secretary for her statement today and her continued leadership on this issue. And can I join the whole House in sending my sympathies not only to the victims, to their families. This is absolutely a dreadful crime, and I'm sure any parent in the room, I am one, is rightly appalled by it. Having worked both in education and also in the charity sector, I saw an awful amount of buck passing when it came to mental health support and also safeguarding issues. And my view was always, if in doubt, report it. And clearly in this case things have been reported, but they haven't been taken forward, which is hugely concerning. What can the Home Secretary do to ensure me that this buck passing, as mentioned by the member opposite, will stop and actually there will be accountability and people will be responsible for these issues?
Home Secretary.
Well, my honourable friend raises a really, really important point. He's absolutely right. The failure of any one organisation or group of individuals to take responsibility for the perpetrator is one of the key failures that has occurred in this case. what phase 2 of the inquiry will consider is what is the best mechanism for managing people who pose these sorts of risks going forward, and recommendations will be made about the proper structure that should be brought forward. I think where somebody meets the prevent threshold, prevent will remain the lead institution for referrals, and of course that referral and onward progression to the channel stream should have happened here, and if that had happened then we would be in a different position today. But for those who don't fall within that threshold, we will need to have a wider system response. As I've said earlier, I am trialling in different local authorities pilots to look at different approaches for what you might do with those individuals who are below threshold. But in the end, I think Sir Adrian Fulford's work will give us the new framework and some guidance as to the best agency that should take the lead in different cases, because I think when an agency takes the lead, there is an obvious sort of accountability, or even if they're convening all of the other agencies, which is how multi-agency safeguarding hubs should work, and sometimes do not. So those are, I think, the key areas that lessons need to be learnt on.
Bradley Thomas.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I thank the Home Secretary for her statement. Does she plan to provide any additional resource or funding to the Prevent programme? And if so, does she have any initial idea as to where that may be targeted?
Home Secretary.
Let me say to the Honourable Gentleman, he raises an important point. When the Government responds in full to the recommendations, I will set out any resource implications that there are, not just for the work of the Home Office, but for other agencies as well.
Andrew Cooper.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And can I join the Home Secretary in commending the bravery of victims in coming forward to give evidence to this inquiry? We owe it to them to make this a turning point, to make certain that the systemic failures and culture that made this attack possible are fixed and can never be repeated. Many of us in this House will recognise from the report the difficulties in accessing CAMs, the ambiguities in responsibility and massive under-resourcing of this vital service. Does my right honourable friend agree with me that this moment calls for nothing less than a revolution in how children's mental health services are commissioned and resourced?
Secretary.
My honourable friend makes an incredibly important point. There are, of course, recommendations for different government departments, including health, to take forward, and I will be working very closely with ministers from across government as we design our response to Sir Adrian's recommendations. But let me tell him on the issue of violence fixation, the descent into nihilism, and that fascination with extreme violence, that does demand a new public policy response from all of government, particularly for those children who wouldn't necessarily meet a test for clinical need, but who absolutely do pose a risk of very serious harm to other people.
Sammy Wilson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. When I heard the news this morning and it was read out the catalogue of failures, missed opportunities and the focus of attention that there was in this murder, and yet he was allowed to get off with it, my heart went out to the families of these 3 wee girls who could have avoided, and their murder could have been avoided, and yet it was missed. And time again in this House, over the time I've been here, I've heard individual child abuse cases, rape gangs, mass murder, and all on each occasion there was failure by public bodies and individuals in public bodies to prevent what could have happened. And unfortunately, and as has been highlighted here again today, there seems to be this attitude that, look, if there's colour or ethnicity involved in it, that's an additional factor and fear of racism. I welcome the assurances that the Secretary of State has given today. But what I would ask is, what steps, given how deeply this attitude is embedded in the public sector now, what steps does she intend to take to make sure that this does not happen again, and that those who are responsible for these decisions are held to account?
Secretary.
Well, the Honourable Gentleman is right. Reading the report of the inquiry, it's horrifying. It makes for incredibly difficult reading, and the recommendations are incredibly important. The Government will respond in full by the summer, and will take forward practical work to make sure that we strengthen all of our systems to make sure this can't occur again. Just let me repeat, the only thing that matters, the only relevant factor when we have a person who is Violence fixated has a fascination with extreme violence is the risk they pose, the assessment of that risk, and then the steps to take to mitigate that risk. No other factor should be taken into account by any agencies. The most important thing is we keep people safe and that we do not allow other irrelevant considerations to play any part. The inquiry made findings in relation to Mrs Hodson, the head teacher, and I endorse, of course, and agree with the findings that Sir Adrian Fulford has made.
Gareth Snell.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Home Secretary aware that there are 28 prevent priority areas across the country. There used to be 40. Stoke-on-Trent was one of them until 2023 when the last government changed the criteria. She'll know that to be a prevent priority area, you normally have to demonstrate either right-wing extremism as a hotspot or Islamist activity as a hotspot, or in the checkered past of my own city, both. If Jonathan Hall's legislative suggestions come into force and we are now having a new offence of non-ideological based fixation with violence, how does the Home Secretary see that playing into those prevent priority areas, given that the locality of that's going to be much more difficult to consider? And post the events in August 2022, when there were riots in Stoke-on-Trent, has the Home Secretary given any thought yet to whether or not any recommendations for where new funding should go to help deal with some of these issues should look at where there was rioting in August 2022, particularly in places like Stoke-on-Trent that don't currently qualify for prevent priority funding?
True.
My honourable friend raises a really important point. Let me say to him that once phase 2 of the inquiry has concluded, especially on the proper mechanism by which we deal with some of these violence-fixated individuals, there will, of course, I think, be knock-on consequences for the wider countering extremism system. It wouldn't be right for me now to get ahead of that, but let me assure him I'm very aware that, both the current work of the inquiry but also the future work of the inquiry will require further clarity, I think, on exactly where responsibilities sit. Prevent as a programme will still, I believe, continue to play an incredibly important role. It will remain our main tool for countering extremism. I'm sure there will be more we can do to strengthen its ability to counter extremism, but there will be knock-on consequences in other parts of the system, including for funding as well. I will be able to set out more of the government's response on that when we respond in full to the inquiry's recommendations, but as phase 2 gets underway, I think that's where some of the real meat of the new policy responses that are needed for violence-fixated children, that's where that will come out.
Joy Morrissey.
A young person who is at risk to harming others will often become known to a teacher, a social worker, a health worker, before any other agency knows that this person is going to pose a risk. There are statutory requirements that make it very difficult to report on a young person if they are below a certain age. Will the Home Secretary clarify if she will work with multi-agency, multi-departmental changes to a statutory requirement that teachers, health workers, all of these, and councils are required to bring forth even a young person who is underage if they are going to pose a risk, if they are of risk, and that will take the statutory requirement above anything else. Because right now, many agencies are afraid to come forward because they feel that there is a statutory requirement to protect the child rather than come forward if there is a harm that they could be potentially giving to someone else.
Good point.
The Honourable Lady has raised an important point. Phase 2 of the inquiry will absolutely consider how we deal with and what the correct public policy response is to children who are violence fixated. One of the horrifying developments of the last last few years or so is that the number of children, ever younger children, who are fascinated with extreme violence, have this sort of nihilistic approach to violence. It's shocking. I've seen cases of very young children, and of course we've got to have an adequate public policy response that is able to counter that descent into violence fixation and to do so effectively. Phase 2 of the inquiry, that is the meat of the work that will be done in phase 2 of the inquiry, and we will obviously follow closely all of the recommendations that they make.
Ayub Khan.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I also share, along with this House, my thoughts and prayers to the victims of this horrific attack in Southport. I also welcome the steps this government is taking to address what can only be described as a very challenging environment. Only 2 weeks ago, I attended the Islamic Jamia institution in King's Standing, along with my honourable member for King's Standing, because we share the boundary line where this institution is located. That building had been attacked a few weeks during the month of Ramadan, and then attacked again with vile vandalism and graffiti. Clearly, attendees of that institution very, very anxious. But it wasn't just the attendees, the local community came out to support the local Muslims. So will the Home Secretary join me in not just commending the actions of West Midlands Police, which acted very swiftly, but also the various faith groups that came together, that don't just come together in solidarity when an incident like this occurs, but are also the very backbone in terms of identifying any form of extremism within our communities?
Secretary.
Thank you. Well, the Honourable Gentleman is right that solidarity between people from different communities, it's something that we don't often talk about in this House, or only do so when a horrifying incident has taken place, but it is the absolute backbone of how we function as a society, and I pay tribute to all of those who spend their time working with people from different backgrounds to themselves, whether that's race or faith, in order to hold our communities and ultimately our nation together. Let me say to him, he's right that there is a very challenging environment when we look at the overall threat picture. The issues that we're dealing with today relate to somebody with no fixed ideology, who's clearly vulnerable to terrorism, but had no fixed ideology, but had this fixation with extreme violence. We have that running alongside the sort of more traditional and well-known and understood elements of extremism, like Islamist extremism or extreme right-wing terrorism. But even within those better understood forms of extremism, the pattern is changing and it's always evolving and developing, and that does pose a challenge to all practitioners to try to keep up with how extremism is presenting itself in our communities. But that is absolutely work that the government is absolutely committed to making sure is as robust as possible, and we take every step we can to make sure that we are countering extremism in all of its forms.
And finally, Jim Shannon.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I thank the Home Secretary for a very positive statement, and associate myself with the events of a year ago when this nation mourned for the 3 children. And I think everyone has recognised the horror of what took place, and our prayers and our thoughts are very much with the families even today, especially with the parents, and I think that's how we all feel, Home Secretary. The report is full, and I commend the author for his determination to ensure that political correctness does not influence the document. It is clear that a sea of change is required in departments to be less concerned about offending innocent people and should be more concerned about protecting our innocence. What lessons can be learned to inform new procedures that must be accountability within the intelligence and the security services in particular? Thank you so much.
Secretary.
Well, the Honourable Gentleman is right. It is cultural change that is needed, and that is what Sir Adrian Fulford's initial recommendations from phase 1 of the inquiry are designed to bring about practical measures as well to change the way in which risk is both assessed and then ultimately mitigated. The government will ensure that we respond in full to those recommendations, but that we bring together every part of government, every part of the state to make sure people are doing everything they should be doing in order to assess risk. The only factors that matter are the risk that is posed by an individual to other people of significant harm of the type that we have seen in this case, and that is what the government will make sure happens in the future.
Can I thank the Home Secretary for her statement this afternoon? I'll allow a few moments for the large front benches to swap over.